In the last week of class, we talked about survey research, in which the researcher develops a set of questions, a set of response categories, and participants are sort of asked the same set of questions. They have to select from a pre-selected set of answers and categories. This week of class, we're going to talk about a different type of research, and that's field research and ethnography. Field research and ethnography are very different from survey research. Some of the features of field research, first of all, is that it's a qualitative form of research rather than quantitative. So rather than collecting a set of standardized responses from people that can be numerically coded and analyzed with statistics, qualitative research involves observation of naturally occurring everyday events, words and actions, behaviors that are observed in real-life social settings. There are two really primary features of field research. The first is that usually the researchers start with a pretty broad set of questions. Maybe they're guided by a particular theory, and they have broad questions about social life. So rather than starting with a specific theory and a hypothesis, the researcher maybe has some very broad questions that are kind of guiding their study. The second is the methodology is really what distinguishes field research. In field research, the methods are primarily based on direct observations in naturally occurring social settings, real social life. So broad research questions and direct observation are two of the distinguishing features of field research. The primary way in which field researchers collect their data is through direct observation. So these are activities that are viewed with the naked eye, things that are overheard in conversation. The other aspect of field research is that it's not occurring in the laboratory. You're out there in the social world. You're in real-life social settings, on the streets, in group meetings. And so this is distinguished. You're not sitting in a laboratory in a scientific setting. You're out there in the world, listening and observing people. And so direct observation in natural settings is one of the things that really distinguishes field research from other types of scientific research in the social sciences. Field researchers usually begin with very broad questions and kind of a rudimentary design to their research. Oftentimes, unlike survey research, where the researcher will develop a sampling frame and have stages of selection for participants, and maybe there's a known probability of selection for all participants in a survey study, field research is very different. It often involves non-random selection of settings and subjects. These might be settings that the researcher has access to, or subjects that the researcher might learn about through their connections to other people. And this is, it's not absolutely necessary to have random selection of settings and subjects in a field research project. This is because an insider's view of social life, getting that kind of inside perspective, does not really require probability sampling. Field research is largely emergent rather than pre-planned. So rather than selecting sampling units, the topics that the researcher is studying, the questions that they're asking, are continuously evolving during the course of the field research study. What's really important is something called theoretical sampling, and this is where the information that's gathered is relevant to the researcher's working hypothesis or theory. One example of this might be a project by the sociologist Kahn, who was kind of interested in elite education in the United States. And he had access to St. Paul's School, which is a boarding school that served some of the wealthiest and most privileged families in the United States. And he had access to the school by being a student when he was in high school. And he kind of leveraged his access to the setting and was able to secure a role as a faculty member to conduct an extended field research project at the school and sort of develop his ideas and questions about what it means to be an adolescent elite at kind of an elite private school. Ethnography is a type of field research, and the term ethnography actually comes from anthropology, specifically cultural anthropology. And the term ethnography refers to description of culture. And this is relevant to sociology. Sociologists are often very interested in social life and sort of the behaviors, the attitudes, the values, and beliefs of people in different groups and organizations. And ethnography can be really valuable for sort of shedding light and understanding those groups and observations. One thing that really distinguishes ethnography is that it's often based on an extended period of observation and data collection. One example of this was a project by the sociologist Alice Goffman, and she published her research in a book called On the Run. And this project began when she was just an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania and continued through her graduate career at Princeton University. And she studied a group of young men in Philadelphia, and sort of was interested in how their lives were continuously entangled with law enforcement, and they had warrants out for their arrests that sort of disrupted their everyday life. So by spending a significant amount of time with these people, she was really was able to understand kind of the web of entrapment that law enforcement poses to young black poor men in Philadelphia. Another ethnography was a project by the sociologist Mitch Mitchell. In his ethnographic research, he studied men and women who were working on the streets of Greenwich Village in New York City, and they were booksellers. They were selling used books on the side of the street. And he was very interested. He gained access to this setting through a man named Hakim, who was one of the primary booksellers on the street. And he found out that many of these booksellers were formerly homeless. They had histories of drug and alcohol abuse, and that bookselling was one of the ways in which they could sustain a living for themselves and live a normal existence. It was very insightful, and he spent several years following, interviewing, and observing these booksellers as they engaged in their work on the streets of Greenwich Village. More recently, Matthew Desmond, a sociologist at Princeton University, spent several years following several Milwaukee families who were kind of living on the edge of poverty, and one of the events that they continuously experienced was something called eviction, where they were thrown out of their homes onto the streets. And he wanted to understand the eviction process, kind of the burden that it placed on families. And so he followed several people who were going through the process of eviction. He followed landlords also to sort of understand their perspective on the eviction process, followed them into the courts, watched how the courts handled evictions, and it gave a pretty comprehensive picture through his several years of field research about what eviction means for families, how people manage the eviction process, and sort of how landlords view tenants and the reasons why they might initiate the eviction. Another example of ethnography is a project by Sudhir Venkatesh called Gang Leader for a Day, in which he spent several years with a crack-dealing street gang in the Robert Taylor homes on the south side of Chicago. And he was actually doing surveys for his professor at the University of Chicago to sort of understand the views and attitudes of people who are living in these projects. And he got to know some of the people who were living in the apartment homes and had access to sort of spend time with them. And he really felt like the field research was much better suited to sort of capturing and understanding the social life of this group of people rather than surveys, who he felt really weren't suited to sort of capturing social life as these people that he was studying were experiencing it. So there are several stages in field research. The first is that the researcher has to select a social setting. The second is they have to get access to that setting. You have to sort of introduce yourself to the people that you want to study. And then you have to gather field observations. And this is often one of the longest parts of field research, is spending time observing people, interviewing them. And then once you've sort of gathered your field observations, you've made field jottings, you can analyze all of that information and develop a theory of social life to sort of answer some of the questions that you were interested in. The primary sources of data in field research are the words and actions of the people that you're studying. So field research really rely on their eyes and their ears to listen and observe people in natural social settings. Once you've collected a set of field research of data from your field research, then you can go into the process of analyzing that data. Barney Glaser and Handsome Strauss refer to the grounded theory process, in which theoretical ideas about social life, emerge from field research in the course of study. And that the process of analyzing data from field research includes really 3 steps. The first is kind of organizing your field notes into categories of content, developing a coding scheme that represents the data, developing your ideas by continually asking yourself questions about that data, and finally kind of identifying the larger meaning of your findings and how they relate to social theory.